Notice how the MR2 cross member is completely absent. There's the rear mount that will attach to the top of the cross member. Just makes things a lot easier to not have it in there. Actually, it would be impossible to put the engine up in there with the cross member in. It's theoretically possible to drop it down from above, but this, believe me, this is far easier. Even when removing the original MR2 engine, either the NA or the turbo, it's easier to drop it down from underneath the car. I've installed all three engine mounts, the driver's side, passenger side, and the front mount. Now earlier I talked about putting the driver's side mount on before putting the transmission into the car, and I want to revise what I said about that. I think it's easier to leave it off, although getting this upper part of the mount in place after the transmission in is really difficult. There's a curve in the frame, so one of the bolts goes in at an angle and one goes straight up, and when you try to put two bolts in at the same time like that, it becomes extremely difficult to get them lined up, especially with the transmission pushing on the rubber portion here, the urethane portion. It pushes the bolts out of alignment with the holes and makes it almost impossible to get in there. So unfortunately there's no other way to do it, so you just have to fight with it. And I think I'm going to go ahead and revise this mount. I don't like the way I designed it and built it. This cushion, this urethane cushion, it does have a safety interlock so you can pull on it, but it's really meant to be pushed on. It's upside down and I'm pulling down on it. It's in tension rather than compression, and it should be in compression. And I think the best thing to do would be to use a suspension bushing just like the passenger side, the right hand side mount. And I think eventually I'm going to rebuild this mount into that style. It'll make it a lot easier to install the transmission and engine as well if I switch it to that style of mount, because then there'll just be two ears that are welded to the car sticking straight down, and the suspension bushing will be in a steel tube that will be attached to a piece that replaces this, and all you have to do is go straight up and it'll slip right in, and the bolt can go straight in this direction. So that would be a far easier way to do it. See, here's what the urethane block looks like. This is the other one that I'm using, and this one here will be in compression. It will be just pushed down on instead of being pulled on, which is this direction. And like I said, you can pull on it, but it's not really designed to be pulled on. Here's what the suspension bushings look like. This is what I used on the right hand side of the car, the passenger side mount. See, there's a steel sleeve, and all you have to do is create a couple of ears that this will slip into and put the bolt straight through, and then you have a steel tube that this slips into, and the steel tube, this is sized so that you can buy off-the-shelf steel tubing to fit these into rather than having something custom machined. So that's really convenient. So I recommend using that for both the passenger side and the driver's side mounts. So I'm on the driver's side of the car, the right hand side. You can see my mount that I made and how it works, and you can also see the front mount. See, it's bolted in place. Notice how I used that angle iron there as a doubler for the body. It's probably overkill, but it can't hurt. It adds some weight though, but strength-wise it can't hurt. I'm on the passenger side, or the right side of the car, looking straight down into the engine bay. Here is the passenger side mount, and you can see the bolt goes straight through. There's a steel tube that was welded to this bracket that I've bolted to the front of the engine, or to the right side of the engine I should say. Now to get this bolt, this is the MR2, I'm reusing the stock MR2 mounting engine mount bolts. This goes straight through. It's a really long bolt. To get that in there, the belt tensioner is kind of in the way. So you can put a half-inch drive ratchet or breaker bar, actually a ratchet, because the breaker bar will only let you do 90-degree increments. But anyway, the ratchet will slip in there, you pull on, or you push on it, and that releases the tension on the belt. You can slip it off this pulley, and that will allow the tensioner to swing away further from where this bolt goes, and so then you can sneak the bolt in this way, and the nut will have to go on this side. It's almost impossible, it probably is impossible to try to bring the bolt in from the other direction, so I don't recommend that. So here's another view from underneath the back of the car. We're underneath the trunk area, and you can see the rear mount is still floating free. I'm going to install the cross member next, and with its associated mount. Here's the cross member with its mount. Now this cross member was an experimental one. You can see I cut it up and welded it back together. It's got no structural integrity, so I'm not going to use it for the final cross member. I do have another cross member to use. See, this was also an experiment, this tube that I welded here. I'm not using that anymore. Instead, I'm going to just bolt this in place with 2 bolts on either side. You can see 1 bolt's holding it now. For purposes of fitting the transmission and everything in, this cross member worked out for that. Originally I cut all this out because I thought the transmission was going to be further back than I actually ended up putting it, so I had to weld all this back up again. But like I said, this cross member has no structural strength anymore, so I'm not going to use it. Also notice the clearance here. I cut the front part of this off right up to the tube that the bolt goes through that holds the cross member on. I'm going to need to weld a plate in place of that, all this area that I cut out. The reason I did have to cut this out, and I will on the new cross member as well, is to provide clearance for the constant velocity U-joint boot, the protective boot. It's kind of a bellows, I'll show you in a second, but it needs to go right where this part stuck out. And one of those boots looks like this. So here's a protective boot, and it would be oriented about like this, and it would be sitting right about here when it's on the car. And the CV joint will be right here, of course, and then the axle will come out this way. So you can see why I had to cut away this. I'll show you once I get everything in place. I'm going to go ahead and install the axles as well. This will be the first time I've ever fitted the axles and checked them to make sure that their length is correct. I have every confidence that their length is correct, but this will be a nice test run, dry test run.